This is section 3, how to cut costs. Section 2 walked through the options that we have for clean fuels and showed that we don't need revolutionary breakthroughs here and new technologies. We know what fuels we can use to address this challenge. The key thing that we need to get through is lowering the cost. And I'll make the case in this section that we can do that by scaling up production. The next 4 slides are going to walk through the relative prices of fossil fuels versus clean fuels. And unsurprisingly, clean fuels are currently more expensive. And that makes sense because fossil fuels have had a centuries-long head start to get to global scale, to maximize efficiency, to develop as cheaply as they possibly can. So it makes sense that clean fuels are behind. Later in this section, we will look at how clean fuels can drop in cost pretty quickly in the near term. But for right now, this is looking at the current state as of late 2021 in the United States. With those conditions in mind, let's look at natural gas and its substitutes. So in the US, natural gas is very cheap, around $2 to $4 per gigajoule of energy. If you add carbon capture to that, say, carbon capture for an electricity generating plant running on natural gas, it's going to get more expensive, but not nearly as expensive as biogas per unit of energy. And a couple of caveats to put here. First, in the US, natural gas is very cheap due to plentiful reserves. And in Europe, it tends to cost about twice as much per unit of energy. In Japan and South Korea, which need to get their natural gas via transport ships, it can cost 3 times as much normally. So its competitive edge is smaller outside of the US. Another point is that biogas does have a significant journey to beating natural gas on cost, at least in the US. New technology is likely needed. This $13 to $24 per gigajoule number for biogas, well, I walked through how I got all of these in the citations in detail. But this is a value for waste-derived biogas. And as I discussed in the last section, if you use waste as your source for a fuel, you are fundamentally limited in how much total fuel you can produce and how much you can cut costs. So personally, I feel that new types of biofuels are probably going to be the way we're going to get biogas to come down and compete with natural gas on cost. And when it comes to new forms of biofuels, I know that I've been very vague on that front. That is a really exciting and very complex sector that I wish I could have covered in more depth in these slides, but there's just so much going on there, and this is already getting to be a pretty heavy set of slides, so I had to skip that. But if you want more detail on how advanced biofuels work, those are things like growing new crops specifically for biofuels, engineering bacteria or other microorganisms to produce fuels, and there is a lot of exciting stuff going on. Please start with the citations in that case and then do additional research because that field is really evolving by the day. Now, another area where that's relevant is looking at oil. So in the United States, oil is both significantly more expensive and significantly more volatile than natural gas. And for oil, clean fuels actually are significantly closer to standard fossil fuel costs already. Now, when we look at liquid biofuels here and see that $17 to $22 per gigajoule range, that is for ethanol. As I said in the last section, ethanol is actually not very environmentally clean when you look at the full life cycle. So it will need to be replaced by more advanced forms of biofuels. But at least ethanol can be a good point of reference for showing where a carbon neutral fuel costs right now. And then advanced biofuels will be going down from that level. Now, let me explain the shaded ranges on the capture segments here, because oil is optimal for transportation. It's often burned in vehicles, and until recently, it seemed like vehicle carbon capture was not going to be feasible. Carbon capture devices can be added to a natural gas plant because those are huge, but it wasn't clear that there would be a cost-effective solution to be able to deploy carbon capture on individual planes, cars, engines. Since then, a startup called Remora has come out alleging that it has a carbon capture solution that can go onto semi-trucks and be cost effective. So for these ranges, what I did was I went and took the numbers Remora has put out publicly so far, made a set of assumptions that are listed in the citations, and estimated what the cost would be if you use that solution. This is approximate. Remora has not issued its product yet. It is planned for deployment this year, and we're going to need to see a lot more data coming out of them. But this was an assumption, again, based on some numbers that you can go check out yourself if you'd like to, for what it would cost. And this is a significantly more optimistic picture than for natural gas, because fossil fuel costs, the clean fuel cost here are not that far apart. The carbon capture element of this, if Remora follows through on what it's promising, could actually be somewhat cost effective. Now let's cover hydrogen, which has a similar story with some very important caveats. So natural gas derived hydrogen remains the cheapest way to get it. But this renewable derived hydrogen number of $33 to $50, that is based on current DOE numbers for projects that are already deployed and operational. That price range correlates to $4 to $6 per kilogram hydrogen prices. And if you cover the hydrogen market at all, you have seen much lower prices than that listed as possible already. Now that's because a lot of companies working here already have electrolyzers in their warehouses actively being deployed now that can deliver hydrogen more cheaply than this range. But to keep these numbers consistent with all of the other ones I've used in this section, I wanted to give the current snapshot of what it costs right now for an operational facility. Also, very important factor in costs for green hydrogen is that the main cost driver is the cost of renewable electricity. So it is impossible to give a solid green hydrogen cost range for the entire planet, because it's just going to vary widely depending on where you are. If you're in an area with very cheap renewables, it's going to be pretty cheap. If you're in an area with very expensive renewables, well, you might not want to put a green hydrogen plant there. A later part of this section is going to go into a lot more detail about how far green hydrogen prices could drop, how quickly. And because these prices can be so variable, and because I get really frustrated depending on people's numbers when they don't explain their assumptions, I actually built my own levelized cost model for blue and green hydrogen that is available on f4blog.org if you would like to go and try it for yourself. It's based on some Department of Energy models, but I put them together, cleaned up some assumptions, added a bunch of functionality to make it smoother to compare different cases. And they allow any user to put in their assumptions for how much they think each technical part of the project should cost, a lot of other technical details, and see what the output price should be. And my follow-up plan for that model, which I have not gotten around to yet, is to also make it able to show an electrofuels price if you convert the green hydrogen into electrofuels. Now, I did not make an electrofuel slide in this section, partially because this is getting really long already, and partially because there are no good electrofuel cost estimates out there right now that I felt good enough to trust without my own groundwork. So I'm going to be doing more technical research there to build the current hydrogen model on f4blog.org into a hydrogen and electrofuels model. So I will be following up with that at some point later. But right now, all I will say is that the electrofuel cost is going to be driven by the green hydrogen cost, if green hydrogen is the source for electrofuels. So for right now, we can assume that if you have expensive green hydrogen, you are also going to have expensive electrofuels. So making green hydrogen cheaper is a key driver in making electrofuels a viable option. With that, here is a summary chart that shows the values we've gone through on the last 3 slides. And I'll actually jump to the next slide, which is that same chart with some additional commentary below. And the takeaway across this section has been that fossil and fossil-derived fuels are currently cheaper in upfront price than clean fuels. That said, as we look at those very low upfront prices, we need to consider the massive societal costs that are coming with them. And the original Freedom from Fossil Fuels deck has a lot more detail on this, But the core takeaways are, for one, air pollution does around $3 trillion of economic damage globally per year. That's equal to around 3% of all of the output of humanity. And it does that through premature death, through disability, through elevated healthcare costs. It's a massive brake on human prosperity. And to those costs, we need to add climate damage, like increasingly frequent, severe natural disasters so damaging that they can shake even the wealthiest countries on Earth, and they can throw already unstable ones completely over the edge. There's also relentless, steady damage to human food supplies, to fresh water sources, to the ability to live on a coastline anywhere in the world. These damages are relentless, and they are part of the full cost of using fossil fuels. The upfront price is only a fraction of what humanity pays for relying on these. Now, compared to that, clean fuels have a much higher upfront price, but they will alleviate a huge amount of long-term damage. Their sticker price actually is their price, because they will avoid these huge pollution costs. They will avert, or at least mitigate, further climate change. And so when you look at those prices, it's not really fair to compare a current fossil fuel price against the current clean fuel price. And even if it were, the rest of this section is going to go through how those clean fuel prices can be rapidly brought down so that they can become the basis for a stable future for humanity. Now, carbon capture also plays a role on both sides. There are those who believe that with carbon capture, fossil fuels can be a sustainable energy source for humanity far into the future. As you can probably guess, given the title of this series, I disagree. And my narration earlier has walked through why, but the fundamental driver of that is that any use of fossil fuels is going to continue adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which is unacceptable when we need to get all of civilization first to neutral and then as far negative as we can. And besides, I believe that clean fuels will outcompete fossil fuels on price eventually anyway. So that it won't even make sense to deploy fossil fuels with carbon capture far in the future. Now, with all that said, I am okay with deploying carbon capture on fossil fuel plants right now, because I think that is, well, it's an unfortunate but necessary feature of the fact that we rely on fossil fuels today, and it will develop and evolve carbon capture technology, which I do believe has a critical long-term role to play here, because if we combine it with clean fuels, it will be a tool for us to have massive global negative emissions that are wired into the economy. And that is a potential pathway to bringing carbon dioxide into Earth's atmosphere back to its pre-industrial total and ending climate change. Now, this next slide is a bit of a guide into where we're going next, and also a bit of an apology, because that feature that I'm describing depends on advances across multiple critical technology areas, especially carbon capture, electrofuels, and biofuels. And for the sake of space and for my own sanity, because all of those could on their own be an even longer set of slides than this one, I am not going to cover them in further detail for now. I would like to cover all of them at some point in separate deep dives. For now, I hope all of the detail and links in the citations are enough additional reading if you'd like to dive in further. But I am going to dive deeper into hydrogen for a couple of reasons. First, it is a critical enabler for a lot of this progress, and it is also a great case study for how all of these could rapidly come down in cost with the right deployment, policy, and approach to innovation. So with that, the next slide is going to dive into the revolution in renewable power over the 2010s, with the key question being whether we can duplicate that massive success in hydrogen. Let's talk about what I mean by the revolution in renewables in the 2010s. This chart on the left shows how far wind and solar electricity, how far their costs have plunged over the 2010s to make them the cheapest new source of electricity in much of the world. And this isn't just improvement over time, it's also critically a story of improvement over total deployment. This chart on the right shows the cost of renewable power against the total gigawatts deployed of that type. And that's on a logarithmic scale. So it goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000. And when you look at it on this scale, it shows that the pace of improvement actually follows a pretty linear relationship. And that speaks to a very important trend called the learning rate, which I'll cover on the next slide. But the core thing I want to focus on here is that a key lesson from this revolution is that R&D and deployment are critical innovation drivers that work best when they work together. So R&D is absolutely critical for bringing better materials, better designs to the field, but deploying things in the field, actually going out and putting these systems in the ground in a highly competitive market, with companies finding every way they possibly can to make the process more efficient, more effective, and then going back to the researchers and sharing lessons learned, and then coming up with new innovations and new ways to reduce costs. That trend, those two groups working together, that is the way to unleash rapid cost reduction. And this is especially critical because many people in the fossil fuel industries who are threatened by clean technology try to hold it back by pretending to be supportive of them, but saying, look, these technologies are great, but they're too expensive right now. So let's just give them some more R&D money, and when they get cheap enough, then we'll deploy them widely. And that's a false argument, and they know it, because R&D alone is not enough to drive rapid cost reduction. It's pairing R&D with deployment, lab improvements with systems in the field, lessons learned from both. That is the way to unleash breakthroughs in cost. Now let's dig deeper on this chart on the right and explore learning rates. So if we look at the improvement of each technology over this period, we see that solar, its capacity increased by about 22 times, its cost dropped by 90%. Onshore wind, 4.5 times, about 51% reduction in cost. Offshore wind, 14 times, about a 30% reduction in cost. And when you look at this chart, you can see there is some kind of linear relationship there. But when you look at these numbers of capacity against cost, it is hard to figure out a formula that connects those two. And that's because it's a logarithmic formula, which is very hard math for anyone to do in their head. But that logarithmic formula is the learning rate. That is the average rate a technology's cost drops when its capacity doubles. So for a technology that costs $100, if its capacity doubles and its learning rate is 20%, then it will now cost $80. And if you apply this formula across these three technology types, what you see is that solar's learning rate over this period is about 40%. Onshore winds is about 30%, and then offshore winds is about 10%. And what's remarkable is that if you look at different parts of this period, that rate was pretty consistent across each of them. And this is true across many other technology areas. This is a very well-known, well-studied phenomenon where some technologies get onto a path where you can predict that whenever their capacity doubles again, they will reduce a predictable amount in cost. Now let's finally pull this back to what it means for green hydrogen. Looking at 2021 production costs for hydrogen in the United States, green hydrogen needs to get over 50% cheaper to start outcompeting fossil-derived hydrogen on price. Now, in most industries, slashing costs by half seems like a pretty tall order. But in this industry, given what we just looked at in terms of the massive cost declines in renewable electricity, it seems a little bit more achievable. So let's look at the components of green hydrogen costs and decide whether those same types of trends could play out here. So the two key areas are the cost of building, installing, and maintaining the electrolyzers, the very complicated machines that turn water and clean electricity into hydrogen. And then the other key cost area is the clean electricity to power that process. Now, we know from the last couple of slides that clean electricity is on learning rate. What's the learning rate of electrolyzers? Studies have estimated that it's around 18% against the 9 to 40% for clean electricity. So we have seen in those two graphs what a 9 to 40% learning rate can do over only about a decade. So if electrolyzers can deliver on this estimated 18% learning rate and can massively be scaled up from a very small base right now, they have a lot of doublings of capacity ahead of them, a lot of turns of the cycle, a lot of times cutting that cost by 18%. And in that context, looking at cutting costs by 50%, it's not easy. One doubling won't do it. Two doublings won't do it, but you're somewhere in the range of 3 doublings of capacity, and you're getting there on the electrolyzer portion. You need to get clean electricity to keep moving down that cycle. But with these learning rates, a 50% cost reduction is achievable in several years if it's scaled up fast enough. And as I've said earlier in the slides, that $4 to $6 per kilogram green hydrogen price, that is for facilities that are already operational right now. The electrolyzers that are in advanced companies' warehouses ready to be deployed can do significantly cheaper than that. So we are already on this road downwards in cost for green hydrogen. And if we can rapidly enough expand production, we're going to be unleashing these same kinds of cost-reducing trends that unleashed renewables over the last decade. So now that we know how green hydrogen could rush down the cost curve, let's look at what we could do about it. So let's think in this mindset of deployment-led innovation, where we're not just relying on R&D to reduce costs, but we're also using deployment and lessons learned to get that cost driven down. Now, this phrasing was initially led by Jigar Shah, who was the founder of Generate Capital, is now at the DOE Loan Programs Office, and is, I think, fair to say, a hero to those nerds of us who follow energy news for fun. A lot of the industry has rallied behind this vision because it is so incredibly effective. And let's look at how the deployment-led innovation cycle applies to clean fuels. Step 1, you produce more clean fuels. And what that leads to is the fuel cost will drop as the producers learn lessons about how to make the process work more cheaply. And when that happens, more customers are able to afford the fuel. And then to meet that demand, you produce more clean fuel. And the cycle keeps spinning faster and faster in a virtuous loop. Now, what governments can do is use subsidies to directly boost step 1, so that at any given price point, more customers will be able to afford the fuel using a subsidy boost than would be able to otherwise. And this is not saying that governments should be intervening in the free market and picking winners and propping up technologies that could not stand on their own. It's saying that when we know a technology is capable of getting much cheaper, but it just needs to get through the initial barriers of starting this cycle spinning, subsidies can be a critical tool for accelerating what the free market would do on its own anyway. It could be the kind of thing where, in a regular free market only approach, the technology might take 25 years to get to where it's eventually going, because in the first cycles, this is spinning pretty slowly and it takes some time to build up. Well, maybe the subsidy could make that process take 20 years or 15 or 10. It's not propping up something that, doesn't need the support and will fall apart when the subsidy leaves. It's accelerating something that would happen anyway. Now, the focus here is the more deployment, the faster the cycle spins and the further the fuel's cost drops along its learning curve. And let's look at this also in the context of that learning curve. This is a hypothetical learning curve, and The slope of the cost decline is set by any given technology's learning rate. And as we saw in the previous slides, that learning rate varies based on the technology. For various technical reasons, solar was especially good at getting cheaper in the 2010s. It had a rate around 40%, while various types of wind power, their rates ranged from 9 to 29%. They were a little bit harder to get down that curve. That they still improve very quickly, but not as incredibly quickly as solar. But once any given technology's learning rate is set, then we know where it's going, and the pace of new production is going to decide how fast the cost declines. The more production there is, the faster and further you move down that learning rate line. And what does that mean? This means that for green hydrogen, we know the learning rate of electrolyzers. We know the learning rates of renewable power. We know where this could go once this cycle spins enough times. And it will spin that many times with or without support, because the free market is able to develop promising technologies that are going to make a ton of money. It's very good at that. But on its own, the free market will do this more slowly than it would if it gets a boost from subsidies in the immediate term to kick off that cycle and to get it spinning really, really quickly. So because meeting the climate crisis is absolutely urgent, and selfishly, because global governments want to make a ton of tax revenue from promising new technology companies that start up within their borders, they should incentivize production to accelerate the clean fuel innovation cycle and fully take advantage of these incredibly high learning rates in critical technologies. Here we'll walk through the takeaways from these slides. Section 1 looked at why there are huge parts of the global economy that have no viable near-term path to decarbonization without cost-effective clean fuels. We cannot decarbonize human civilization without them. Section 2 walked through the clean fuel options we already have ready to begin scaling up. We know what these options are going to be. We know what infrastructure they are going to demand. We know what we need to aim for. The question is just which paths we choose and how quickly we can get their costs down. And Section 3 makes the case that investing in scaling up clean fuel production is the best way to slash those costs. So what we can do as individuals here depends on where we are in the economy. At the very least, clean fuels need to be a central part of government and industry climate plans. Traditionally, renewables have gotten more attention than clean fuels. The attention to fuels is really rising recently, and that's fitting because they are a huge part of the puzzle of decarbonization. Those who are in government have a critical role in allocating procurement, tax incentives, subsidies, and R&D funding to accelerate the development and, critically, the deployment of clean fuels across economies. Fuel-consuming companies can make a huge difference by testing and adopting clean fuels wherever possible. For a company that has massive fuel consumption, say as in transport, even putting a small portion of their fuel use over to clean fuels can make a massive amount of difference for a small group of innovators who are just trying to get off the ground. That can be a transformative impact that really drives this market forward. For fuel producing companies, if they're a startup making these, they're already fighting the good fight. But for other ones that are already established, pursuing clean fuel production either alone or partnering with some of those startups to help them get to market, that can also make a huge difference. And finally, citizens have a massively important role here too, by pressuring policymakers and companies to adopt clean fuel strategies. Lawmakers are the ones who decide on policy, on subsidies, on what government money will support. And that money should be supporting clean technology over fossil fuels. And then for companies, if citizens let it be known that they care, if the companies that they buy from are using clean technology, that can make a big difference too. For these large companies, again, if they go and buy clean solutions, that can be a transformative impact by giving an anchor customer base to innovators developing new solutions here. So don't underestimate how much of a difference you can make by pressuring lawmakers and the companies you buy from to push for these critical technologies. Now with that, thank you for joining me for this overview of clean fuels. I hope this was useful to understand where we're at right now, where we're going in this critical industry. Well, as I said during the slides, there are a lot of areas here that I really want to follow up on. But for now, I hope the level of detail here and in the citations is enough to work with. I think I ended up with 17 slides of citations with size 10 font of additional commentary that I wrote, with links to additional sources that have far more additional reading than that. So if you want to dive into this in more detail, I definitely recommend starting there. And please don't take my word for any of this. This field is really rapidly evolving, which means it's really rapidly getting its own share of policy controversies. I am only one perspective out of many. There are opinions from all sides on the right way to do this. And I hope this can be a jumping off point if you'd like to go dive more into where out of all of those debates you fall in your personal opinions. With that, thank you again for joining me. And if you'd like to see any more content like this, please go to f4blog.org, where I have additional briefings, the hydrogen cost model, and I'll be posting additional content as I go.